Okay, hi everyone, I'm Millie. I'm a second year history and politics student and one of the ambassadors and founders of Black Feminist Space. So we're just going to tell you a bit about the organisations that made this possible, and then we'll get started with the panel. So Black Feminist Space is a collaboration between the Black Ed movement and Girl Up Edinburgh, both organisations which are centred around the University of Edinburgh.
So hi everyone, I'm going to be joining Millie in co-hosting this phenomenal panel discussion. I'm also at the University of Edinburgh. I study maths and philosophy in my second year. So let me get started on kind of what Girl Up is all about. So Girl Up Edinburgh is a university society and a part of the specific Global United Nations Foundation movement that aims to train and equip students who identify as females with skills needed to run university societies with the intention of uplifting women and catering to their needs in a society that undervalues them at every turn.
And then the Black Ed movement was founded by 7 amazing Black female law students at the university last year in response to George Floyd's killing in the US and the University of Edinburgh's lack of response. And the movement was founded to envision and implement practical solutions to continuing action against racism on campus, and the movement is entirely student-led, and Black Feminist Space, as a combination of the two, have been running a series of panels on reproductive justice, which Sharissa will introduce you to.
Right, so I think what's important here is that we understand what reproductive justice is. So the reproductive justice framework acknowledges the ways that socioeconomic status, gender, race, and of course sexual orientation shape reproductive healthcare experiences and health policy. So the term reproductive justice was conceptualized in the US and meant as a unifying term that would allow women across the world to direct their protest and calls for justice towards a specific cause. So you might be thinking, then what is the difference between reproductive justice and the reproductive rights framework? Well, the reproductive rights framework is a more individualistic and legal approach, while reproductive justice is expansive, intersectional, and holistic. So to end, reproductive justice encompasses all factors that affect women's reproductive journeys. And so these same factors impact the reproduction of a society. So in turn, these factors impact a society. And so reproductive justice is a topic for discussion for everyone. I hand over to Millie now.
Thank you, Sharissa. So we've got 2 amazing panelists here today. We've got Siri and Thea, and I was just wondering if Siri and Thea, would you be able to both introduce yourselves and say what you do for a living and explain how your work relates to the topic?
Okay, should I start?
Siri, you can go first.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Oh, so I can go first. there was a bit of a delay there. Okay. Yeah. How this relates to my work, I would say, number one, I'm a trans woman. And in my trans womanhood, I have found that, there are stereotypes in society that have pushed me to step into the field of activism. So in my journey, I found that I've perpetually, in whatever space I go into, I've had to almost be, shrink myself and explain myself in my every move. Where do I come from? Who I am? Try to unpack what being transgender is, and try to, acclimatize myself so that I can become accepted in that space, and then by the same token respected. And I would say that this speaks to the same conversation of equality and access to equal rights. And so by my experience, I have then come into contact with agencies, different institutions that assist me to be a part of the kind of change that I would like to see in my country in terms of the dynamics around gender, the treatment of women, and equality in general in our society towards social cohesion. So right now, I would say that one of the pertinent conversations that I'm in terms of my work is the Safe Zones program at Wits University. So the Safe Zones program is run by a fundamental gender nonconforming individual by the name of Tish Louis-Moss. So Tish Louis-Moss is the programs coordinator of the Safe Zones program, which is a program run within Wits University. Now, Wits University is, I believe, one of the best universities on the African continent, and it is the flagship university. That's where all the programs start. And Tish has been the overseer of transformation in many big ways within this program. And I'm one of the facilitators of this program, where we give awareness, and we provide conscientizing sessions, workshops with faculty, with staff, with students, about the issues of patriarchy, the issues of, forcing women to live out their lives in particular ways. And this even applies as far as, issues of abortion, issues of, dictating. I mean, this is my body. And if I want to take hormones, that's what I want to do. And however it is that I choose to live out my life and choose to do with my body is my prerogative. And I believe that the Safe Zones program is probably one of the most relevant sort of programs that I'm involved in that speak to the question about reproductive justice, and speaking to, allowing women to have the agency to make their decisions and live out their truth in their bodies, and actually be respected within their bodies as well. And I feel like in our society, there's just been, a strong tradition of the belittling of the woman, of the, the subordination of womanhood. And I think in this era, more than ever, we definitely need to keep highlighting over and over again, until it's indoctrinated within the system, that we are all equal, whether you're trans and gender diverse, or you're a member of the disabled community living with disabilities, or you're just, an able-bodied cis person. We are all equal. And in the work that I do, we provide sensitization trainings, where we sit down with men, women, gender-conforming persons, and we speak about these issues. We speak about HIV and STIs and AIDS and safe sex, all kinds of, speaking to, how the woman is sort of subordinated sometimes within the relationship, and not given the option to say that I want to use protection. I would like to give the child up for adoption. When it's your body, and you should have a voice as well. And with our program, we have these conversations, and we try to push the envelope toward, a patriarchy-less society and inclusivity. Yeah, I hope I didn't say too much.
Thank you so much, Sia.
You go ahead, Millie.
That was really great. Thank you. Siri, would you be able to introduce yourself?
I think you froze there for a minute for me, Millie, but sure, I'm so happy to. Thanks so much for asking me to be part of this panel. And Sia, it's such a pleasure to be sharing this space with you today specifically. And yeah, so I'm Siri May, and I currently work at the Center for Reproductive Rights, which is a global organization that uses the power of the law to advocate for reproductive and sexual rights across the world. Not really speaking on behalf of the Centre today, though. I'm speaking in my personal capacity. And I've been working in and around human rights, HIV, sexual health for about 25 years. And I started as an activist in that space. It's because these are issues that directly affected my community, and my community is a queer community, and it's a community made up of people who use drugs and sex workers. And so for me, reproductive justice is both a sort of formal analytical framework that was developed by Indigenous women, women of colour, and trans and non-binary folk, really in response to the lack of inclusion of these groups in the International Conference on Population Development way back in 1994, probably a time that perhaps some of you won't remember, but I certainly do. And that was really about centralising the voices of affected populations in their own response, and using human rights principles to ensure that that could be realized. And so for me, reproductive justice, you know, it's an integral part of the work that I've always done, and it is about ensuring that there is nothing about us without us, that the voices of those who are affected by the issues that we're talking about are centralized in any response. And that's protected by international human rights, which is an area that I work in. But it's also, you know, really at the center of any effective public health response as well. So if you don't involve people who are affected in helping to craft responses that make sense to them, then we can't ensure things like the right to life, the principle of non-discrimination and equality, as Sia was talking about, are respected in those responses to health issues. And the health issues in reproductive justice, sure, they're about reproduction, but they're also about sexual health. They're about bodily autonomy, the right to decide. And I think that those issues really need to sort of be, you know, articulated in a way that makes sense to lots of people, not just white cisgendered women. And so really reproductive justice is there to disrupt those mainstream conversations and make sure that there's an avenue of access for people who are directly impacted.
Siri, thank you so much for those answers, and Sia. So I think both of you have actually answered our first question, which is, can you define reproductive justice and what it means to you? So I think Millie can go on to the second question, but before that, I just wanted to let all our participants know where everyone's joining us from. So Sia is joining us from South Africa, and she kind of lives in Johannesburg. And Siri is joining us from the US. Siri, where exactly are you joining us from?
Such a great question. Usually New York, but at the moment I'm in Vermont. That's a state just above New York and in the middle of a very snowy day here.
Oh.
Thank you so much, Sharissa. So yeah, I'll move on to kind of our first main question. And that is, how can trans-inclusive and non-binary inclusive feminism change the lives of trans and non-binary people, but also change the lives of everyone? If we have a feminism that's more inclusive, how does that change our lives? If either of you wants to jump in.
Okay, I might as well start if you don't mind. Okay, I would say, I think the more voices we get on board, the better. But I think that it's convenient to compartmentalize our struggles. It's easier to say, white cis women should worry about white cis women issues, and black cis women should worry about black cis women issues, and disabled cis black women, you know what I mean? And compartmentalize all the ways in which we're different. But I think that when we actually come together and we fight toward equality and we raise our voices collectively, I think that can really yield a larger impact in the long term. And I would say that the biggest problem that we've probably all had is that we have been lost in the system of patriarchy. We have had our self-esteem and the largest sort of manifestation of the imposter syndrome, and not deeming ourselves worthy of equality, that we fight amongst ourselves. We fight about our race, we fight about our class, we fight about who's woman enough. You're trans, you're not woman. You're able-bodied. You're definitely not feeling my struggle. I have a disability. You know what I mean? And at the end of the day, we all have our own struggles. But when feminism becomes the term that we actually use as an umbrella term to say, we are fighting for equality. We don't care what race you are. We don't care what disability that you embody in the way in which you move through space. We want to include everyone and collectively funnel the kind of change that we want to see. And, in different conversations, we all stand together. Even though I'm a trans woman, I definitely want to see the rights of a cis sex worker realized. I want to see everyone feeling and realizing their highest potential in whatever space they navigate. And I think that when we come together collectively, we can have a bigger impact. And I think all of us as activists anyway, we are humanitarian at heart, we are human rights activists, and we all have the same outcry. We all are human beings. And we all have needs of being accepted, of having equal access, health, etc. And when we come together and we use our dialogue, we use our activism, we use our resources, we mobilize for change collectively, we can have a higher impact and we can get more resources aimed at the kind of change that we want to see, instead of being disaggregated by patriarchy. Because patriarchy is an amazing animal that is so well structured, and it's intrinsic within the system, and it's been entrenched for decades, centuries. And if feminism is as aggregated as it is right now, it's not going to get as far as it needs to. But I mean, as the old, days of old, or rather the wise of yesterday used to say, together we stand and divided we fall. And I feel like feminism needs to collect and get together toward the kind of change that we want to see. Yeah.
I mean, desegregated by patriarchy is definitely a soundbite that I'll take from that, Sierra. It's so beautiful. I think the question you asked, Millie, is how can trans-inclusive and non-binary feminism change the lives of trans and non-binary people? I think the first thing I would say about that is that feminism is a moving framework, a set of questions that we can ask, which situates gender as a metaphor for power. That's basically what we're doing here, right? And I think that rather than feminism changing the lives of trans and non-binary people, trans and non-binary people have changed feminism for the better and will continue to do so. And we're so lucky, we should be so lucky to have the participation of a more intersectional group of people who experience oppression on the basis of gender, or perception of gender, or gender expression. I completely agree with Sia. We are better off for it. We share a common enemy. Our enemy is patriarchy, white supremacy, colonialism, and feminism is one way that we can, create coalitions to, as Sia said, effectively respond to that intersectional oppression that many of us experience is from the same source. And I think there's no better or more effective way for patriarchy to keep people oppressed than to divide and conquer, than to make you believe in the false reality that the bit that they're prepared to give you is all you're going to get, and you should fight over the breadcrumbs rather than collectively join forces to seek the bread off the table. And so for me, I think, rather than see it as a top-down approach that saves anyone, I think it's only living, breathing place to ask questions, and the more people that are there that are able to unpack the various ways in which patriarchy and white supremacy and colonialism really oppresses all of us in different ways, the more people that are there at the table asking those questions, the better we are. And I think we really need to consider the way that our own unconscious bias, the feminist movement, plays out to exclude people and marginalize people, which is the anathema of what feminism was meant to be doing. It's meant to be bringing people together and collectivizing, offering us tools for, pursuing social justice. And, I think that nothing about us without us is, again, such a central tenet in this, but also to borrow consideration from one of my own countries, Australia. There is an Aboriginal activist called Leela Watson who said, if you're here to save us, you're wasting your time. But if your liberation is bound with ours, let us walk together. And if we walk together, we are much more effective in unpacking the ways in which we can live a full, equal life that is considered equal in the eyes of the law, but also equal in society. And equality is not sameness. Equality is equal access, and it's equal value. It's not complete decimation of difference. And I think my feminism is about seeing diversity as a point of celebration rather than just something to be feared. We have such fierce activists that have so much experience fighting the same enemy. We're better off when we're in a room together talking about what that looks like for each of us.
Siri and Sia, that was amazing. That was really well answered. So let's go on to the next question. What are the biggest obstacles faced by trans and non-binary populations when trying to access safe reproductive health care, and how can this be changed? Sia, if you want to go first. Put you on the spot there.
Yeah, not so much. I was trying to wrap my head around it. How can this be changed? I would say that the biggest challenge, as far as reproductive healthcare is concerned, in my experience, it has been, number one, the law. The conversation that I actually just came from now in the previous panel discussion sort of speaks to that. Some of the laws within my country want us to be assisted, by the medical fraternity, by a social worker or a psychiatrist and a doctor. So those two, a social worker and a doctor, to give you the go-ahead to be defined as either gender non-conforming or transgender, so that you can have your gender marker changed. And I would say that it's one of the problems, because not everyone has access to a doctor. Some trans women live in areas where there are no local hospitals, and there might be some clinics, and those clinics as well are under-resourced, and they don't understand what it means to be transgender or gender non-conforming. And so they can't provide those letters, and someone would need to travel far in order to access those hospitals and the resources they need in order for them to actually have, the letters they need to then apply for a gender marker change. So for example, if I was born and identified as male at birth, and then I identify as female and would like to have my gender marker changed. So, the marker that would say, or the indicator on your smart card, your ID card, ID book, that actually says male or female, you would want to have that changed to then obviously be congruent with your gender presentation, the way in which you navigate space, the gender that you affirm in your day-to-day life. You would then need to, go through the process of, seeking assistance from a social worker and doctor, getting those letters. And I'm lucky, I do live in an urban area, so I can access a doctor, I can access a social worker. But obviously there's a backlog, a lot of people, obviously, so obviously there'd be lines, queues. And the process is also laborious, because obviously one has to pay for that. So not many trans and gender diverse persons actually have the funds to be able to apply for the process as well. So, a person with cisgender, for example, wouldn't have to apply to indicate that they're cisgender on their ID or the smart card, but someone who's trans actually has to pay. And it's something that's still debated to this day, but it's one of the bureaucratic systems that we just have to, overcome. So I would say it's those issues, like issues of urbanity and rural dichotomies for trans and gender diverse persons, not being able to access these processes that allow them to be able to take full advantage of these policies that are actually in place. Like South Africa is one of the most inclusive countries on the African continent when it comes to gender and gender diversity. But implementation is still a problem, because we have such a backlog of access when it comes to equality and equal footing, especially people who live in rural communities and the unemployed. And I would also say that when it comes to access to safe reproductive in my country, high, I do believe it's somewhere around 40 or 50%. And that's a huge concern, because obviously that means that majority of the people in my country don't have full access to proper healthcare. So we do have a good healthcare system that is state funded, but even the state funded platforms require you to donate some form of money in terms of administrative fees, etc. And some of those as well are too much for people. So you find that you would have to pay a fee of about 70 something rand, 100 rand, etc. And to an unemployed person, that's literally food for a whole week. And the majority of the trans and gender diverse persons in my country, particularly young trans and gender diverse persons, find themselves forced to go into sex work because they're disowned by their families. They're disowned by their communities, and they find that they have to make their own way. And it's not always easy. I mean, I myself have, I think, 4 degrees now, like 4 academic degrees, and I still struggle to find employment. It's very difficult. So you find that on paper, yes, people love saying, yes, we're inclusive, yes, yes, yes. But when it comes to actual implementation, to say, in your business, how many trans and gender diverse persons are you hiring? Nobody's actually doing that. Like, not many companies are inclusive enough to include trans and gender diverse persons into their economic activities because of, the shame as well, the stigma, having these people in your space. And, some of our society, sections of our society rather, are still very traditional, very culture-based and religious as well. And these different paradigms of thinking are driven by patriarchy, and they speak to a very binary way of thinking and not allowing for gender diversity at all. And this now obviously impacts on reproductive access to reproductive health care, because now if someone is unemployed, then they don't have access to a private doctor, then they have to go to state facilities, and obviously a lot of the state doctors are actually they're actually students who are currently, undergoing their practicals in university and aren't exactly professional medical healthcare practitioners that would be able to give them the kind of quality healthcare that they need to receive. And I would say, and how can this be changed? Okay, I would say, that's a difficult one. Wow. That's a difficult one. How can this be changed? I think for me, I've actively been trying to create awareness through the programs that I'm involved in. I try to take part, in government dialogues, in government, position papers, etc. I try to contribute my 2 cents and try to give them direction on how to be more inclusive in the way that they, arrange their policies, in the way that they conceptualize gender, so that we can actually benefit from that. But we find that, legislation sits in the citadels of parliament and it never actually finds its way to the grassroots and in implementation and impacting the lives of day-to-day lay people like myself. Because we find that, yes, it's written in the Constitution that everyone is equal. But when you actually come in for an interview, people will look you up and down and tell you, don't call us, we'll call you. And at the end of the day, we find ourselves grasping at straws to access opportunities. Unless, of course, you're lucky enough to have either a very supportive family or a rich partner, or get into sex work, which is what a lot of my trans and gender diverse friends end up doing, not out of choice, but out of circumstance, that there are limited opportunities and inclusivity within society. And with systems of patriarchy as well, people that do discriminate are very protected, because you find that if you are someone who says, no, I will not stand for harassment, I will not, accept discrimination, you're seen as someone who's into bigotry, who just wants to be difficult for the sake of being loud. And people actually forget that all we want to do is be respected. We all just want to be treated like human beings. And it's something that's seen as a luxury in some spaces. Yeah.
Yeah,
I hope you can hear me.
Yes, no, we could hear you loud and clear.
Okay.
That was breathtaking. I mean, as a South African, it was great hearing this, because you can kind of stay in South Africa but not know anything about what you were talking about. So thank you for that. Siri,
Maria.
well, it's your turn.
Thank you. I agree. What a beautiful answer. And, I think that as he was talking, one of the things that was occurring to me, first of all, I'm an ally. I don't identify as trans or non-binary. I'm married to a trans person and I work in those communities, but I certainly can't speak on behalf of trans or gender non-conforming communities. It's not my lived experience. But I can talk as a practitioner in health promotion and human rights, and I can talk as an activist who's in those communities. And I think the first thing I would say when we're asking a question about what the biggest obstacles are, as Sia was saying, the biggest obstacles are going to change depending on who you are. Trans, gender non-conforming populations are not a monolith. They don't experience the same issues. That changes between geography, between people over time. And so the first thing I would say is let's always be cautious about creating a monolith of a group when we're talking about shared obstacles. They are really going to change depending on other factors when we're talking about intersectional experience. There may be someone who is living in a particular geography that has totally different issues around access to sexual reproductive health services than another. But as a group, what we know there's a dearth of information and good evidence that really can help guide us in answering these questions, but there is some evidence, and the evidence that we have generally tells us that as a group, trans and gender non-conforming people experience higher rates of discrimination, higher rates of violence, harassment, and bullying as a group on the basis of their real or perceived gender identity or expression. So we already know that there are a lot of difference of experiences based on these perceptions that need to be accounted for when trying to access services. And as Sia said, those barriers to access can be legislative. South Africa has one of the most progressive constitutions in the world. We always hold it up as the gold standard in the UN. And again, the implementation can be really difficult. So when we're talking about a legislative environment, there are lots of historical laws that specifically target trans and gender non-conforming people. And that can be explicit laws which outlaw things like cross-dressing. I don't think that that's a term that I agree with, but by law, cross-dressing can be something that's criminalized, and it is still criminalized in some countries. There are other issues around the ways in which legislation around loitering or vagrancy is used to target gender non-conforming and trans people, and other laws such as the recent laws in the Philippines that are meant to be targeted at drug users, which are also then used to round up trans and gender non-conforming people and prosecute them. So there are a whole heap of legislative barriers that criminalize the lives and experiences of trans and gender non-conforming people in a way that makes access to service provision almost impossible because it's dangerous. You can't present to a healthcare service when your very existence is criminalized. So that's kind of one of the first major issues, and that's different between countries and sometimes even between states in countries. And I think the second thing, in human rights, we talk about a framework called the AAAQ framework, which is a framework around how to assess whether a service is compliant under international human rights law. So that's to say that for a service to be up to those standards, it needs to be available, needs to be accessible, it needs to be acceptable to the group that it is meant to be servicing, and it needs to be of a high quality. So if we think about what that means for trans and gender non-conforming people, sexual and reproductive health services need to be available and accessible without discrimination. And that without discrimination can be complex because it is about addressing some of those legislative barriers, but it's also about addressing other barriers like being able to access the cost of the service, like being able to ensure that service providers are educated and competent when it comes to dealing with people who are trans or gender non-conforming. We could use a word like pregnant people instead of just pregnant women, acknowledging that some people who are pregnant actually identify as men and have a biology that sort of still enables them to become pregnant. And I think a different part of this conversation too is to ensure that people with different sex characteristics, which is totally different from trans and gender non-conforming identities and expressions. So remembering that there are male and female sex characteristics, but of course, we're also talking about the fact that up to 2% of the world's population are actually intersex, which means that they have sexually ambiguous reproductive systems. And we need to ensure that our healthcare systems work in an evidence-based framework that can still supply the services needed by everyone, irrespective of that diversity, and give them a proactive set of tools that enables them to be competent and non-discriminatory in the way that they provide those services. And that's like a complex issue around legislation and also policy and adequate public health programs as well.
Thank you so much, Siri and Sia. That was really, really interesting, especially how you both talked about how it's not just legislative rights that matter, but also implementation. So the next question is focused on, so as I'm sure you both know from your work, society and the media have an incredibly unhealthy obsession with the bodies and the body parts of trans and non-binary populations, and this kind of obsession. How can we advocate for informative binary populations without fueling this unhealthy obsession that the media has with kind of the bodies of trans and non-binary people?
Okay. Oh my. I think these conversations are, you know, part of the change. I would say that I don't think that there has been enough, you know, stories of trans persons told by trans persons, and that element of humanity amplified. So when I say that, I mean those nuances, because you find that a lot of these narratives are directed by cis persons who are interested in having a trans person in their productions, in the media, whether it is Netflix special or whatever it is. And there aren't, I would say that there isn't enough representation that is purely, you know, dictated and directed and informed by the experiences of trans and gender non-conforming persons. And I think that sensitization is key. I think that the lack of sensitivity is to a lack of information, and I don't think that enough of the cis community and general humanity actually has the gist of what experiences of trans people are outside of the drag experience and RuPaul, etc. I'm trying to refer to RuPaul. I'm not sure if I'm saying it correctly. And you know, the caricature, you know, and the dramatization of what it means to be trans is very different from the everyday experiences and the discrimination, etc. And I think that those stories need to be amplified, you know, even in our education system. Now, it's very difficult, obviously, to get into that territory, because I feel that obviously parents are very picky when it comes to what information is shared with their children. But I think that that is something that could be elected by parents who are interested in having their children exposed to sensitization training when it comes to being, you know, sort of diverse in the way they think and in the way they support their general society. Because I do think that, yes, we are all different in many ways, but in our differences as well, we need to also remember that we're human. I keep reminding and repeating this message in many different conversations, that we've lost our humanity, so lost in our identities and in our citadels and silos of existence and identity, that we forget that that we all just want to be loved, respected, and to have equal access to healthcare, etc. And I think that sensitization is part of the key, you know, part of the solution that we need in all the sectors of our society. And I would say, I mean, we're very lucky that our systems of bureaucracy today, capitalism, they force professionals to actually learn, to always be perpetually upgrading their skills and their education. And perhaps maybe we could plug into those systems and formulate, you know, different workshops and sensitization training systems and instruments that we could put together, that we could universally apply, whether it's the film industry, the healthcare industry, and we sensitize these professionals within these various sectors of our society to be more inclusive. And hopefully this can open the door to better understanding. And I feel like media is a tool. You know, I don't think that it's something that's in the hands of only journalists. So when I speak about performing these can I call them rituals, these sensitization trainings, that we could use media as a tool to provide these sensitization training, whether it is via Netflix or whether it is a special that we air on Fox News or whatever it is. But it sort of gives people the gist of just how the system is failing to actually be inclusive and treat everyone with respect and open the door for inclusivity and the transformation that we do need. I wanted to go back to the end part of, so without fueling the obsession, okay, of the bodies. Yeah, I would definitely, I'd still conclude with the same point that I think the lack of awareness is the beginning of the problem. And I think that once we have awareness, that people are then free to have their own perspectives, but they have the option to now understand what they're doing is wrong. And if they then choose to still, you know, go forth and be prejudiced and discriminatory and obsess on the bodies of trans and gender non-conforming, then, you know, I guess they've chosen to be discriminatory, and obviously they'll bear the brunt of whatever policies are in place in terms of framework of the law. But I would say that, you know, since we are all human, I would like to believe that once someone actually knows that, you know, their behavior is compromising another person's dignity, another person's access to just, you know, respect and basic human rights, I think that, you know, they'd be more sensitive and they'd be more inclusive in the way they engage. Can you hear me?
Thank you.
I'm getting worried. I thought maybe there was lag.
So that was it. No, thank you. No, that was a great answer. Thank you so much. Siri, do you have any?
Sure. I mean, you know, I think, yeah, again, such a beautiful answer from Sia. And, you know, what I would say is, how can we advocate for those appropriate, you know, sort of appropriate information and service provision without fueling an unhealthy obsession? You know, if you are not part of the trans and gender non-conforming community, the first thing I would say is ask the trans and gender non-conforming community how they would like to see that done. And that is always, it needs to be the first point of departure is consultation, real, equal, full, and meaningful participation of those directly affected. You know, when I think when we talk about the unhealthy obsession of the media of the bodies of trans and gender non-conforming people, what we're talking about is pathologizing those bodies or fetishizing those bodies. And, you know, this is what patriarchy loves to do with bodies that are not the bodies of white cisgendered heterosexual men. They do it with cisgendered women's bodies, and they also do it with the bodies of gay men who were, you know, sort of either only existed in legislation because they were criminalized or pathologized. I mean, you know, really, you've got like centuries of interventions on the bodies of women and queer people. And I think our sort of responses, again, coming back to those first questions about how to kind of ensure that patriarchy doesn't get to pathologize or fetishize the bodies of anyone that isn't cisgendered, white, and heterosexual, needs to be intersectional feminist discussion like this. And the first point of any intersectional discussion is to centralize the voices of those who are affected first. And again, you know, I think talking about bodies is actually wonderful. I come from a really sex positive place of health promotion. So I don't think talking about bodies is always unhealthy. I think it's awesome. It just needs to be that if it's my body you're talking about or the body of someone else that you're talking about, their voice is in that, the center position for that discussion, and it's a respectful one.
Siri and Sia, thank you so much for those really great answers. Now, kind of our question time is over. So if any of the participants has a question for either Siri, Sia, both of them, you can like drop a message on the chat bar, or you can unmute yourself, or yeah, whatever works. Yeah, just pop it on the chat bar. I mean, while the questions come in, oh, perfect, we have one. I'll just read it out for everyone. What strategies do you recommend for accessing a hysterectomy in Scotland? Siri, maybe this is a question for you. What?
That seems like quite a specific question. I have to say, in full disclosure, I don't live in Scotland, although I was born there. What I will say is that you have a national health service, which means that you have a relatively public, that your health services are publicly accessible, and also to say that there are many reasons for needing or wanting a hysterectomy. And so it would be really difficult to answer that question because I'm not a healthcare professional in terms of navigating what the health system could look like there. I would say that a hysterectomy is a really personal decision, and it may, it would, how do you get around the transphobia? Oh, interesting. I do actually think that there, from memory, actually, there is an international, and I can't remember, I used to work with them in a different job, but there is an international coalition of medical professionals that work specifically around ensuring that clinical service delivery is trans and gender non-conforming competent, and you can access information for them which you can hand on to your healthcare service provider. But also check on your legislative environment. So it may be that your provider is actually required to build their capacity on this issue so that they can meet their fulfillment and non-discrimination under anti-discrimination legislation in Scotland, which I, from memory, again, I don't operate in this context anymore, but I do actually think you have quite extensive coverage in non-discrimination law. So I'd be happy to try and find those names and share them with you later, Joe, if that's helpful.
I'll just quickly read out the question. Do you have any advice for people who want to get more involved in reproductive justice, either volunteering or as a career?
Okay.
Yeah, I can give that a shot. But Sia, please feel free to come in on that as well. I think it depends on where you live, but there are many amazing reproductive justice organizations out there who offer intern projects. I know in the States, Sister Song, for example, is an incredible reproductive justice organization. I know there are an equivalents across the United Kingdom and Europe as well. So look for your organizations that do work in that area and see if they've got any opportunities for volunteering and interning. But yeah, I would definitely say it's going to be specific again to the place that you're living. And buy books. There are so many amazing books by just really radical Indigenous, women of color, people of color, gender and non-conforming people that are out there that have written extensively on this topic. So I'd also say, before you go in there to volunteer, arm yourself with some good writing that's been done there too.
Right. So if anyone has any other questions, feel free to put in the chat bar. But for now, I think I have a question. So, and I think this has been touched on, but it'd be nice to kind of conclusively answer it. So what positive efforts do you know of worldwide that are transforming the reproduction process for trans and non-binary people?
I mean, I would say the work that Sia already outlined in what she does on a daily basis, to me, sounds like it's transforming access to service provision for trans and gender non-conforming people in South Africa. And I'd say that you would find comparative projects to that in so many different countries, depending on, what their circles of activism look like. Some countries have incredibly progressive non-discrimination legislation. I know Australia, for example, where I used to work and live, has just been, we have an X marker on the passport. We have comprehensive anti-discrimination legislation that means that healthcare providers are obliged to ensure an experience of non-discrimination for people who are gender non-conforming or intersex or trans. And I think, the things that we need to think about are how to create an enabling legislative environment. That is up to the state to create, but then the process of ensuring that things are like radical and progressive, that needs to come from community, and community needs to be at the center of their own responses for that. And I just have to say, like, seeing reproductive health services start to use words like pregnant people instead of pregnant women, you know, making sure they have visibility markers over their service provision to ensure that people who do need to access their services feel welcome there. And the more we've got, you know, we've got people who are public health students and public health practitioners that are doing more and more fantastic work collecting evidence that ensures people actually have an experience which is based in reality rather than what we think is happening, is great too. So, you know, I just think there are so many different amazing responses at the ground level, like Sia was talking about, the international level too, that it's almost too much to kind of like say one example in particular. But
oh yeah, I actually forgot to mention this one, but I am working on a gender affirming healthcare guidelines process with the HIV Clinician Society here in South Africa, in collaboration with Gender Dynamics. It's an NPO, nonprofit organization here in South Africa. The HIV Clinician Society is basically just a collective of healthcare professionals that deal specifically with STIs and administration of access to healthcare for people who are living with HIV, and obviously their caregivers, etc. And in this program, actually, we're using technology, we're using social media as a way of reaching out to the community, and we're currently compiling guidelines for the healthcare fraternity on the global, just a universal toolkit that the healthcare professionals can use to refer to with regard to how to be more inclusive in affirming gender within the healthcare space. And I would say that the whole sort of aim of the Gender Healthcare Guidelines campaign that I've been sort of overseeing was to just collectively get a stance from the community on what terminology to use and what are they comfortable with regard to how the healthcare system administers reproductive health care and access to, you know, the general needs that they have as the trans and gender non-conforming community, and how they can be more inclusive. So these guidelines sort of inform what the trans experience has been and what they'd like to see. And this is now, you know, going to be readily available for healthcare professionals across the board to use. And I'm really excited actually about the campaign. It's something that it's something I've been thinking about at the back of my head, and randomly out of nowhere, I was invited to get on board. And if you do get a chance, please do check it out. I think it's available on Facebook as well. It's called the Gender Affirmative Healthcare Guidelines. Yes. If you can search that out on Facebook, you'll be able to obviously find, some of the work. We haven't compiled the guidelines as yet, but they should be available before June.
Thank you so much. That is amazing answers from both of you. And I think Sharice and I will wrap up the panel now. I'm really sorry for any extra questions that weren't heard, but unfortunately our Zoom calls have a habit of ending without warning at 7:30. So we don't want to cut any of our lovely speakers off. But I want to thank Siri and Sia so much for speaking and for sharing their experiences and their work. And yeah, thank you for the organisations and for Sharice for co-hosting, and thank you all for coming. We'll be hosting one final reproductive justice panel on sustainability in another few weeks, so keep an eye out for that. But thank you, everyone.
thanks so much. Bye-bye.